A baby girl was born unwanted the second her skin color didn't match her parents. A hospital told them she was a mistake, and they almost believed it. This story is about how one tiny heartbeat can break generations of prejudice. Where are you listening from today? Stay with me. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor as a young couple stood frozen in the maternity ward corridor. Their faces, pale with shock, stared through the nursery window at a tiny infant wrapped in a pink blanket. The baby's dark skin contrasted sharply with the couple's fair complexion, and the silence between them spoke volumes. "There's been a mistake," Bertha Collins whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. Her husband Oscar stood beside her, his jaw clenched tight, his blue eyes cold as winter steel. What happens when the most fundamental assumption about family, that blood determines belonging, is shattered in a single moment? How do we define love when it's tested by the unexpected? The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as Dr. Neal approached the couple with a clipboard in hand. His weathered face showed the exhaustion of a man who had delivered countless babies, but his eyes held an unusual concern. The soft crying of newborns echoed through the ward, a symphony of new life beginning, while one small life hung in the balance of a decision that would echo through decades. Everything the Collins family believed about their perfectly planned life was about to crumble. Their suburban dream home, their carefully managed finances, their image in the community, all of it seemed suddenly fragile when faced with this tiny, breathing contradiction to their expectations. "We need to discuss the situation," Dr. Neal said gently, his accent thick with years of delivering difficult news. "The tests have been run multiple times. There's no error in the hospital records." Bertha's hands trembled as she gripped her husband's arm. This wasn't how their story was supposed to begin. They had planned everything so carefully. The nursery painted in soft yellow, the college fund already started, the family photos that would line their mantelpiece. But the child behind the glass didn't fit their picture-perfect narrative. The central question that would haunt them all: can love be learned, or is it only born from recognition? Bertha Collins had always been a woman of precise plans. At 28, she taught third grade at Riverside Elementary, where her organized classroom and gentle demeanor made her beloved by students and parents alike. Her auburn hair was always neatly pinned back, and her warm brown eyes usually sparkled with the joy of nurturing young minds. She had married Oscar straight out of college, and their 5-year marriage had been marked by careful financial planning and methodical steps toward their dream of parenthood. Oscar Collins, 31, worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. His analytical mind approached life like a spreadsheet. Everything had its place. Every decision was calculated. He wore his responsibility like a well-tailored suit, never a thread out of place. The pregnancy had been planned down to the month, timed perfectly with their insurance coverage and Bertha's summer break from teaching. The inciting event that would change everything had occurred 9 months earlier in the most ordinary of circumstances. Bertha's pregnancy had progressed normally, with regular checkups and no complications. They had chosen not to learn the baby's gender, wanting to preserve the surprise. They had never imagined that the real surprise would challenge everything they thought they knew about family. St. Mary's Hospital sat in the heart of their middle-class neighborhood, a place where Bertha's own mother had given birth to her 30 years earlier. The maternity ward was known for its compassionate care, but on this particular Tuesday morning in March, it became the stage for a drama that would ripple through multiple lives. Dr. Stella Neal had been delivering babies for 15 years. She had seen every possible complication, every family dynamic, every joy and heartbreak that came with bringing new life into the world. But she had never seen parents react quite like this. The way Bertha's face had drained of color, the way Oscar had stepped backward, as if physically pushed. It told her this was going to be more complicated than a simple birth certificate correction. The true antagonist in this story wasn't a person, but rather the crushing weight of societal expectations and personal prejudices. The opposing force was the fear that lived in Oscar's heart, fear of the unknown, fear of judgment, fear of loving something that didn't match his predetermined vision of family. As the couple stood in that hospital corridor, they faced their first impossible choice. The baby girl behind the glass was legally theirs, biologically theirs, but in their hearts she felt like a stranger. The question that would define the next 30 years was simple yet devastating. What do you do when love doesn't come naturally? Bertha reached toward the window, her maternal instincts warring with her confusion. "She's so small," she whispered, and for a moment Oscar thought he saw something soften in her expression. But the moment passed like a cloud over the sun, and the reality of their situation settled back over them like a heavy blanket. Dr. Neal cleared her throat. "You need to make a decision about the birth certificate. The legal documents need to be signed, and the baby needs to be discharged to someone's care within the next 48 hours. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Bertha looked at Oscar, searching his face for answers, but found only the same confusion and fear that filled her own heart. The baby in the nursery continued to sleep peacefully, unaware that her entire future hung in the balance of a decision her parents weren't prepared to make. What they didn't know was that this moment would create ripples that would reach far beyond their hospital room, affecting not just their lives, but the life of a child who would grow up to hold their fate in her hands 30 years later. The Collins family's modest 2-story home on Maple Street had never felt smaller. Bertha sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, staring at the legal documents Dr. Neal had given them. The yellow nursery upstairs seemed to mock them with its cheerful teddy bear wallpaper and carefully assembled crib. Everything they had prepared for their new arrival now felt like evidence of their failure to accept what fate had given them. Oscar paced the small living room, his accounting mind trying to calculate the financial implications of their decision. The medical bills were already mounting, the extended hospital stay, the genetic testing, the counseling sessions Dr. Neal had recommended. Their savings account, which had seemed so stable just a week ago, now felt inadequate for the challenges ahead. "We can't do this, Bertha," Oscar said finally, his voice hollow. "Look at us. We're not prepared for this situation." Bertha looked up from the papers, her eyes red from crying. "She's our daughter, Oscar. The tests confirmed it. Whatever happened, however it happened, she's ours." "Is she?" Oscar's question hung in the air like a challenge. "When I look at her, I don't see us. I don't see our family. I see a problem we're not equipped to handle." The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had spent months reading parenting books, taking classes, preparing for every possible scenario, except the one that had actually occurred. Bertha had always prided herself on being open-minded, on teaching her students about diversity and acceptance. But when faced with the reality of raising a child who would never fit the family portrait she had imagined, her theoretical tolerance crumbled. Their families had made their positions clear during the tense phone calls over the past 3 days. Oscar's parents, retired and living in Florida, had suggested that perhaps this was God's way of telling them something. Bertha's mother, a practical woman who had raised 3 children on her own after Bertha's father died, had been more blunt. "You have to think about what's best for everyone involved, honey, including that baby." The social worker, Mrs. Charlene Larson, had been assigned to their case when Dr. Neal realized the complexity of their situation. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, having worked in child services for over 2 decades. She had seen every possible family dynamic, every form of rejection and acceptance, but something about the Collins case troubled her deeply. "The baby is healthy," Mrs. Larson had explained during their meeting that morning. "She's been in the hospital for 5 days now, and the nursing staff has been caring for her, but she needs to be discharged to someone's custody by tomorrow afternoon." Bertha had held the baby briefly that first day, feeling the weight of the tiny life in her arms. For a moment, she had felt something, a flutter of connection, a whisper of maternal instinct. But when she looked into the baby's dark eyes, she saw a future filled with questions she couldn't answer, stares she couldn't ignore, and a love she wasn't sure she could sustain. "What happens if we—" Bertha couldn't finish the sentence. "If you relinquish parental rights," Mrs. Larson completed gently. "She would go into the foster care system. Given her age and health, there's a good chance she would be adopted quickly. There are many families looking for infants." Oscar seized on this information like a lifeline. So she would find a good home, a family that could love her properly. Mrs. Larson studied him carefully. "Mr. Collins, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. If this baby had been born looking exactly like you expected, would you be having this conversation?" The question struck them both silent. Oscar's face flushed, and Bertha looked away. The honest answer was too painful to speak aloud. "I see," Mrs. Larson said softly. "Then you need to understand something important. This decision isn't just about the next few years. It's about the rest of your lives. And more importantly, it's about hers." That evening, Bertha stood in the nursery doorway, looking at the unused crib, the carefully folded clothes, the mobile that played a gentle lullaby. She had imagined this room filled with laughter and love, but now it felt like a museum of broken dreams. The baby clothes she had chosen so carefully, tiny dresses in pastel colors, soft sweaters with small animals, suddenly seemed like costumes for a play that would never be performed. Oscar found her there, his own face etched with exhaustion and conflict. "I called the hospital," he said quietly. "They need our decision by 8 a.m. tomorrow." Bertha nodded, unable to trust her voice. She had always been the one her students came to when they needed comfort, when they felt different or left out. How could she explain to them that their teacher, the woman who preached acceptance and kindness, had failed the most important test of her life? "I keep thinking about what people will say," Bertha whispered. "At school, at church, in the neighborhood. How do we explain this to everyone?" Oscar's jaw tightened. "We don't. We move forward with our lives and try to forget this ever happened." But forgetting wasn't as simple as filing away documents or packing up a nursery. The baby they were about to abandon had already changed them, had already revealed parts of themselves they didn't want to acknowledge. The question wasn't whether they could forget. It was whether they would ever be able to forgive themselves. Mrs. Larson had left them with one final piece of information that night. "The baby will be placed in emergency foster care tomorrow if you don't take her home. Her temporary guardian will be Rita Mann, a woman who has been fostering children for 12 years. She's particularly skilled with infants who have been relinquished." The clinical term couldn't soften the reality of what they were about to do. They were going to walk away from their own child, leaving her to be raised by strangers because they couldn't see past their own fears and prejudices. As Bertha turned off the nursery light for what she thought would be the last time, she didn't know that the baby girl sleeping in the hospital would grow up to become someone extraordinary. She didn't know that Rita Mann would love that child with a fierceness that would shape her into a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence. Most importantly, she didn't know that in exactly 30 years, their paths would cross again in the most unexpected way possible. The papers they would sign in the morning would legally sever their connection to their daughter, but they couldn't erase the fact that their DNA ran through her veins. And sometimes blood has a way of calling us back to face the choices we thought we had left behind forever. The next morning would bring the moment of truth, but it would also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring them face to face with the child they abandoned, in a courtroom where she would hold the power to decide their fate. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Bertha and Oscar Collins sat in their sedan, the unsigned papers on the dashboard between them. It was 7:45 a.m., and they had exactly 15 minutes to make the decision that would define the rest of their lives. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the only sound in the oppressive silence that had settled over them like a heavy blanket. Bertha's hands trembled as she reached for the papers one final time. The legal language was cold and clinical. Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. Such sterile words to describe the abandonment of their own flesh and blood. She had read each line dozens of times, hoping to find some loophole, some way to make this choice feel less like a betrayal. "We should go in," Oscar said, his voice barely above a whisper. His accountant's mind had run the numbers over and over throughout the sleepless night. The financial burden of raising a child who might face discrimination, who might need special support, who might never fit into their carefully constructed suburban life, it all seemed overwhelming. But as they walked through the hospital's automatic doors, Bertha felt something break inside her chest. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of machines created a soundtrack to what felt like a funeral procession. They were walking toward their daughter's room not to take her home, but to sign her away forever. Mrs. Larson was waiting for them in the family conference room, her expression carefully neutral. She had seen this scenario play out too many times before, but something about the Collins case had kept her awake the previous night. In her 2 decades of social work, she had learned to read the subtle signs of parental ambivalence, and she sensed that this couple was making a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. "Before we proceed," Mrs. Larson said gently, "I want you to understand exactly what this means. Once you sign these papers, you will have no legal rights to this child. She will be placed in foster care, and if she's adopted, her records will be sealed. You may never see her again." Bertha's breath caught in her throat. Never see her again. The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. She thought about the tiny fingers she had briefly held, the way the baby had turned toward her voice, the soft weight of her in her arms. How could she promise to never see her own child again? What about her future?" Bertha asked, her voice cracking. "Will she know about us? Will she understand why we—" "Children who are relinquished at birth often have questions when they're older," Mrs. Larson replied honestly. "Some seek out their birth parents, others don't. But Bertha, I have to ask you, if she came looking for you 20 or 30 years from now, what would you tell her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Oscar's face had gone pale, and Bertha could see the war raging behind his eyes. What would they tell her? That they had been scared? That they had been too worried about what other people would think? That they had chosen their comfort over her well-being? I don't know," Bertha whispered. Mrs. Larson leaned forward, her professional composure softening slightly. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen children thrive in foster care and adoptive families. I've also seen birth parents who regretted their decisions every day for the rest of their lives. This isn't just about the next few years. This is about who you are as people." Oscar stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, he could see other families coming and going from the hospital, some carrying new babies, others visiting loved ones, normal families living normal lives. Why couldn't they have that simplicity? "You don't understand," Oscar said, his back still to them. "We're not equipped for this. We don't know how to raise a child who doesn't look like us. We don't know how to answer the questions, how to deal with the stares, how to navigate a world that's going to judge us and judge her. So you're going to let fear make this decision for you?" Mrs. Larson asked quietly. The words hit Oscar like a physical blow. He turned around, his face flushed with anger and shame. "It's not fear, it's reality. We're being practical. We're thinking about what's best for everyone involved. Including her." Mrs. Larson gestured toward the door, toward the nursery where their daughter waited. "Have you thought about what's best for her?" Bertha broke down completely then, her careful composure crumbling like a house of cards. The sobs that had been building for days finally broke free, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know how to love her," she choked out between tears. "I look at her and I feel nothing, just confusion and fear. What kind of mother does that make me?" Mrs. Larson moved to sit beside her, her voice gentle but firm. "It makes you human, Bertha. Not all maternal bonds are instant. Sometimes love has to be learned, practiced, chosen every day. But you have to give it a chance to grow." Oscar returned to his seat, his anger deflating into exhaustion. "What if we can't learn? What if we try and fail? What if we damage her more by keeping her than by giving her to a family who can love her properly from the start? What if you don't give yourself the chance to find out?" Mrs. Larson countered. "What if you're stronger than you think? What if love is more powerful than fear?" The clock on the wall showed 8:15 a.m. They were already 15 minutes past the deadline, but Mrs. Larson made no move to hurry them. She had learned that some decisions couldn't be rushed, that some moments required all the time in the world, even when there was no time left. Bertha looked up, her eyes red and swollen, but suddenly clearer than they had been in days. "I want to see her again," she said quietly. Before we decide. I want to hold her one more time." Mrs. Larson nodded, understanding the significance of the request. "Of course. But Bertha, I need to warn you. If you hold her again, if you look into her eyes and connect with her, it's going to be even harder to walk away." "Maybe that's what I need," Bertha replied. "Maybe I need it to be hard." They walked to the nursery together, the three of them moving like mourners in a funeral procession. The baby was awake, her dark eyes bright and alert, her tiny fists waving in the air. When Bertha picked her up, something shifted in the room. The baby settled against her chest, her breathing synchronizing with Bertha's heartbeat. "She knows you," Mrs. Larson observed softly. "She's been waiting for you to come back." Oscar watched from the doorway, his own heart breaking as he saw his wife cradle their daughter. For the first time since the birth, he saw them as they were meant to be, mother and child, connected by something deeper than appearance, bound by something stronger than fear. But the weight of their decision still pressed down on them. The papers waited in the conference room, unsigned but ready. Their families expected them to make the practical choice. Their friends would understand if they decided they weren't ready for the challenges ahead. Society would forgive them for being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Bertha looked down at her daughter's face, memorizing every detail. The shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, the way her eyes seemed to focus on Bertha's voice. If this was goodbye, she wanted to remember everything. "What's her name going to be?" Bertha asked suddenly. If she goes to another family, what will they call her?" Mrs. Larson hesitated. Her foster mother, Rita Mann, has been calling her Isabella. It means pledged to God in Spanish. She thought it was appropriate for a child who needed extra protection. Isabella. The name wrapped around Bertha's heart like a gentle hand. Their daughter had a name, an identity beyond the legal documents and medical records. She was Isabella, and she was theirs, and they were about to give her away. The moment stretched between them like a bridge over an impossible chasm. On one side lay the safety of their previous life, the comfort of familiar expectations and manageable challenges. On the other side lay the unknown territory of raising a child who would force them to confront their own prejudices, their own limitations, their own capacity for growth. Oscar stepped forward, his decision crystallizing in his mind. "I'll sign the papers," he said firmly. "This is too much. We're not the right family for her." But as he reached for Isabella, intending to take her from Bertha's arms and end this painful charade, the baby's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. The grip was surprisingly strong, and when he looked down into her face, he saw something that stopped him cold. He saw himself, not in her features or her coloring, but in her determined expression, in the way she held on when he tried to pull away. He saw his own stubborn streak, his own refusal to give up easily. Oscar Collins stood frozen in the hospital nursery, his daughter's tiny hand wrapped around his finger like a lifeline. The grip was so small, so trusting, yet it held the power to anchor him to a future he had been trying to escape. Bertha watched her husband's face, seeing the war between love and fear playing out in his expression. Mrs. Larson remained silent, understanding that this moment would determine not just Isabella's fate, but the trajectory of 3 lives. "I can't," Oscar whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this to her." Bertha's heart lurched. "Oscar, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we're making a mistake," he said, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Look at her, Bertha. Really look at her. She's perfect. She's ours. And we're about to throw her away because we're scared of what other people might think." Mrs. Larson stepped forward gently. "Oscar, are you sure? This decision can't be made lightly. Raising a child is a lifelong commitment, and raising a child who may face additional challenges requires extra strength and dedication." "I know," Oscar said, finally lifting his eyes to meet his wife's gaze. "But I also know that if we walk away from her now, we'll never forgive ourselves. We'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what if, and she'll grow up wondering why we didn't want her." Bertha felt something shift inside her chest, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. The fear was still there, but it was being overwhelmed by something stronger, a fierce, protective love that she hadn't known she was capable of. "You're right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We're her parents. That's not a mistake. That's a gift." Mrs. Larson smiled for the first time since she'd met them. "This is going to be challenging," she warned. "There will be difficult moments, questions you don't know how to answer, situations that test your resolve. But if you're committed to this, if you're willing to learn and grow together, then Isabella is very lucky to have you." Oscar gently took Isabella from Bertha's arms, holding her close to his chest. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "Together." But their decision to keep Isabella was only the beginning of their journey. The next months would test their resolve in ways they couldn't imagine. Oscar's parents called less frequently, their disappointment palpable in every stilted conversation. Bertha's mother visited once, held Isabella briefly, and then made excuses about being too busy to help with babysitting. The isolation was subtle but constant, a steady erosion of the support system they had taken for granted. At Bertha's school, the whispers started immediately. Parents who had once chatted warmly with her now offered tight smiles and quick exits. The principal, Mr. Oscarson, called her into his office 3 weeks after she returned from maternity leave. "Bertha, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Some parents are confused about your family situation. They're asking questions about Isabella's background." Bertha's hands clenched in her lap. "What kind of questions?" "Well, they're wondering if there might be complications. Some are concerned about behavioral issues or learning disabilities that might be genetic. Others are asking if you've considered that Isabella might be better suited to a family that shares her cultural background." The words hit Bertha like physical blows. These were parents she had worked with for years, people who had trusted her with their own children's education. Now they were questioning her fitness as a mother because her daughter didn't look like them. "Mr. Oscarson," Bertha said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "Isabella is 3 months old. She's healthy, happy, and loved. If parents have concerns about their children's education, I'm happy to discuss that. But my family is not up for debate." Mr. Oscarson shifted uncomfortably. Of course. I just wanted you to be aware of the atmosphere. It might be best if you kept your personal life separate from your professional responsibilities." Bertha left that meeting feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. The people she had dedicated her career to serving were now treating her like a pariah because she had chosen to love her daughter. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years teaching children about acceptance and diversity, only to discover that the adults in her community had learned none of those lessons. Oscar faced his own challenges at work. His colleagues, who had once congratulated him on the pregnancy, now offered awkward condolences, as if Isabella's birth had been a tragedy rather than a blessing. His boss, Mr. Harrison, called him into his office 6 months after Isabella's birth. "Oscar, I need to discuss your performance review," Mr. Harrison said, shuffling papers on his desk. "Your work has been distracted lately. Errors in calculations, missed deadlines. I understand you're dealing with some personal challenges." Oscar's jaw tightened. "My work has always been exemplary, Mr. Harrison. If there are specific issues, I'd like to address them." "Well, there's also the matter of the company picnic last month. Some of the wives were uncomfortable with the questions about your daughter. It created an awkward situation." The memory of that day still burned in Oscar's mind. He had brought Isabella to the company picnic, proud to show her off to his colleagues. But instead of admiration, he had encountered curious stares and whispered conversations. One wife had actually asked if Isabella was adopted, and when Oscar explained the situation, the woman had made a comment about genetic surprises that had made his blood boil. "I'm not sure what you're asking me to do," Oscar said carefully. "I'm asking you to be more discreet about your family situation. The company values stability and professionalism. We can't have personal drama affecting the workplace dynamic." Oscar felt the familiar rage building in his chest. "My daughter is not drama, Mr. Harrison. She's my family." Of course. I'm just saying that perhaps it would be better if you kept your personal life separate from your professional responsibilities." The echo of Mr. Oscarson's words was unmistakable. Oscar realized that he and Bertha were facing a coordinated campaign of subtle ostracism, a gentle but persistent pressure to hide their daughter away, or better yet, to make her disappear entirely. That evening, as Oscar and Bertha sat in their living room with Isabella sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, they made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would not hide their daughter. They would not apologize for loving her. They would not allow other people's prejudices to dictate their family's future. "We're going to move," Bertha said suddenly. "Away from here. Somewhere we can start fresh." Oscar looked at her in surprise. "Move? Where?" "I don't know yet. But somewhere Isabella can grow up without carrying the weight of everyone's expectations and judgments. Somewhere she can just be herself." Oscar nodded slowly. "It'll mean starting over. New jobs, new community, new everything." "Then that's what we'll do," Bertha said firmly. For her. They spent the next 6 months planning their escape. Oscar found a position with an accounting firm in Portland, Oregon, 3,000 miles away from their current life. Bertha applied for teaching positions in suburban school districts, where no one would know their history. They sold their house, packed their belongings, and prepared to build a new life where Isabella could grow up free from the shadows of her birth. The night before they left, Bertha stood in Isabella's nursery, now mostly empty except for the crib and a few remaining toys. Isabella was 8 months old, crawling and babbling, her personality beginning to emerge. She was curious and determined, with an infectious laugh that could light up any room. She had her father's analytical mind and her mother's gentle nature, but she also had something uniquely her own, a resilience that suggested she would be able to handle whatever challenges life threw at her. "I'm sorry," Bertha whispered to her sleeping daughter. "I'm sorry we couldn't be stronger from the beginning. I'm sorry we let fear cloud our judgment. But I promise you from now on, we'll be the parents you deserve." As they drove away from their old life the next morning, Isabella sleeping peacefully in her car seat, Bertha and Oscar felt a mixture of sadness and hope. They were leaving behind everything familiar, but they were also leaving behind the judgment and prejudice that had poisoned their first months as parents. They didn't know that their decision to move would give Isabella the foundation she needed to become extraordinary. They didn't know that the challenges they had faced would make them stronger, more empathetic parents. They didn't know that the love they had almost thrown away would grow into something powerful enough to sustain them through the difficulties ahead. Most importantly, they didn't know that Isabella would grow up to be someone who would change the world, not through grand gestures or revolutionary discoveries, but through the quiet power of justice and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a second chance. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since Isabella's birth, the Collins family was traveling it together. 29 years later, Judge Isabella Marie Collins Mann stood in her chambers, adjusting her black robes before what would be the most significant case of her career. The nameplate on her desk bore the hyphenated surname that told the story of her life. Collins for the parents who had almost abandoned her. Mann for the foster mother who had been prepared to love her if they had failed. At 39, she had earned a reputation as one of the most fair-minded and compassionate judges in the Oregon state court system, known for her ability to see beyond the surface of cases to the human stories beneath. Her rise to the bench had been anything but easy. Growing up in Portland as the obviously adopted daughter of white parents had brought its own set of challenges. There had been curious stares, awkward questions and assumptions about her background that followed her from elementary school through law school. But Bertha and Oscar Collins had kept their promise from that hospital room 30 years ago. They had learned to be the parents Isabella deserved. Bertha had thrived in her new teaching position, eventually becoming a principal known for her inclusive approach to education. Oscar had built a successful accounting practice, specializing in helping small businesses owned by minorities navigate the complex world of taxes and regulations. They had learned to talk openly about race, identity, and belonging, conversations that had been painful at first but had ultimately strengthened their family bonds. Isabella had inherited her mother's compassion and her father's analytical mind, but she had also developed something uniquely her own, an unwavering commitment to justice. Law school at Stanford had been followed by a clerkship with a federal judge, then years as a public defender fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. When she was appointed to the bench at 36, she had been the youngest judge in the district, and one of only a handful of Latina judges in the state. Now, as she prepared for the morning session, Isabella reviewed the case file that had landed on her desk through what could only be described as cosmic irony. Collins versus State of Oregon, a civil rights lawsuit filed by her own parents against the very hospital where she had been born. The case had begun 18 months earlier, when Bertha and Oscar, now in their late 50s, had been contacted by a private investigator working for a law firm representing victims of medical discrimination. It turned out that Mercy General Hospital had a decades-long pattern of providing inadequate care to patients of color, including a shocking number of mistakes in the maternity ward that had resulted in babies being separated from their biological parents. Isabella's birth had been one of dozens of cases where the hospital's negligence, or worse, deliberate malpractice, had caused devastating consequences for families. The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified records, manipulated test results, and a systematic pattern of telling white parents that their babies were hospital errors when the children appeared to be of mixed race or had darker skin than expected. Dr. Neal, now in her 70s and long retired, had come forward as a whistleblower. Her testimony revealed that Isabella's parents had been pressured to relinquish their rights, told that the baby was somehow not theirs despite genetic testing that clearly proved otherwise. The hospital had been conducting an unofficial genetic cleansing program, encouraging white families to abandon children who didn't meet their aesthetic expectations, while simultaneously steering those children toward minority families or the foster care system. Bertha and Oscar had joined the lawsuit not for money but for justice. They wanted accountability for the trauma they had experienced and recognition of the institutional racism that had nearly torn their family apart. But neither they nor their lawyer had anticipated that the case would be assigned to Judge Isabella Collins Mann. Isabella sat at her desk, reading her parents' depositions for the third time. Bertha's testimony was heartbreaking. "We almost lost our daughter because a hospital told us she wasn't ours. We almost believed them because we were too ignorant and frightened to trust our own hearts. If we had walked away from Isabella, it would have been the greatest tragedy of our lives." Oscar's testimony was equally powerful. "The hospital exploited our fears and prejudices. They made us feel like we were victims of a mistake, instead of parents of a gift. They nearly convinced us to abandon our own child, because she didn't look the way we expected." The irony was not lost on Isabella. The parents who had once considered abandoning her were now fighting for justice, not just for themselves, but for all the families who had been torn apart by the hospital's discriminatory practices. They had grown from frightened young adults into advocates for civil rights, and their transformation had been shaped entirely by their decision to keep and love the daughter they had almost lost. Isabella knew she should recuse herself from the case. The judicial ethics guidelines were clear about conflicts of interest, and presiding over a case involving her own parents was exactly the kind of situation that demanded recusal. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the realization that this case represented the culmination of her entire life's journey, from an unwanted baby to a judge who could ensure that other families never experienced what hers had endured. The defense attorney for Mercy General Hospital, Alvin Bradley, was a smooth corporate lawyer, known for his ability to minimize damages in medical malpractice cases. He had already filed several motions attempting to dismiss the case, arguing that the statute of limitations had expired and that the hospital's actions, while regrettable, were not criminal in nature. Bradley's strategy was clear: portray the Collins family as opportunistic litigants seeking to profit from a decades-old misunderstanding. He planned to argue that any trauma they experienced was the result of their own prejudices, not the hospital's actions. It was a calculated approach designed to shift blame from the institution to its victims. The lead plaintiff's attorney was Nellie Hansen, a civil rights lawyer who had built her career fighting institutional discrimination. Hansen had uncovered the hospital's pattern of abuse through years of meticulous investigation, interviewing dozens of families who had been affected by the systematic separation of children from their biological parents. Chen's strategy was to demonstrate that the hospital's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate pattern of racial discrimination. She had medical experts prepared to testify about the impossibility of the genetic mistakes the hospital claimed to have made, and sociologists ready to explain the broader context of medical racism in American healthcare. As Isabella prepared for the pre-trial conference, she wrestled with the ethical implications of her position. Every legal principle she had been taught demanded that she step aside and allow another judge to handle the case. But every instinct she had developed as an advocate for justice told her that she was uniquely positioned to understand the true stakes of this lawsuit. The case was about more than monetary damages, or even institutional accountability. It was about the fundamental question of whether medical institutions could use racial bias to manipulate families into making decisions they would regret for the rest of their lives. It was about whether the healthcare system could exploit parents' fears and prejudices to serve its own agenda. Isabella thought about all the families who had been torn apart by the hospital's actions, children who had grown up believing they were unwanted, parents who had lived with decades of guilt and regret. She thought about the babies who had been placed in foster care not because their parents couldn't care for them, but because a racist institution had convinced loving families that their children weren't really theirs. The more she considered the case, the more Isabella realized that her unique perspective wasn't a conflict of interest. It was exactly what this case needed. She understood both sides of the trauma because she had lived it. She knew the pain of feeling unwanted and the joy of being loved despite initial rejection. She knew the weight of making life-changing decisions based on fear and the redemption that came from choosing love over prejudice. But Isabella also knew that her decision to hear the case would be controversial. Legal experts would question her judgment, the media would scrutinize her motives, and the outcome of the trial would be forever linked to her personal story. If she ruled in favor of her parents, critics would accuse her of bias. If she ruled against them, others would question whether she had bent over backward to appear impartial. As she sat in her chambers that evening, Isabella looked at the photo on her desk, a picture of her with Bertha and Oscar at her judicial swearing-in ceremony. They looked proud and happy, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of parents who had watched their daughter achieve something extraordinary. It was impossible to imagine that these loving, supportive people had once considered abandoning her in a hospital hallway. The transformation of her family was a testament to the power of second chances and the possibility of redemption. But now Isabella faced the most difficult decision of her career. Should she recuse herself from a case that could bring justice to her own family and dozens of others? Or should she use her unique understanding to ensure that the truth finally came to light? The pre-trial conference was scheduled for the next morning, and Isabella knew that her decision would set the tone for everything that followed. She had until 9 a.m. to decide whether Judge Isabella Collins Mann would preside over Collins versus State of Oregon, the case that would determine whether her parents' 3-decade journey from fear to love would finally be recognized by the justice system they had all sworn to serve. Judge Isabella Collins Mann entered her courtroom at exactly 9 a.m., her decision made. She had spent the entire night wrestling with the ethical implications, consulting legal precedents, and examining her own motivations. In the end, the answer had come not from law books or ethics guidelines, but from the fundamental principle that had guided her entire career. Justice must be served, regardless of personal cost. She had decided to hear the case. The courtroom was packed with media, legal observers, and families who had been affected by Mercy General Hospital's discriminatory practices. Bertha and Oscar Collins sat in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, their faces showing a mixture of nervousness and determination. They had not expected their daughter to be assigned to their case, and the shock of seeing her name on the docket had left them reeling. Isabella had not spoken to her parents about the case. Judicial ethics required that all communication go through the attorneys, but she could feel their eyes on her as she took her seat behind the bench. The weight of their shared history filled the courtroom like an invisible presence. "Before we begin," Isabella announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "I want to address the obvious question of recusal. It has come to the court's attention that the lead plaintiffs in this case, Bertha and Oscar Collins, are my adoptive parents." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Alvin Bradley, the defense attorney, sat up straighter, sensing an opportunity. Nellie Hansen, the plaintiff's attorney, remained carefully neutral, though Isabella could see the concern in her eyes. "After careful consideration and consultation with the Judicial Ethics Committee," Isabella continued, "I have determined that my unique perspective on this case is not a disqualification, but rather a qualification. I understand intimately the harm that was caused by the defendant hospital's actions, and I am therefore uniquely positioned to ensure that justice is served fairly and completely." Bradley immediately stood. "Your Honor, I must object. This presents an obvious conflict of interest that—" "Mr. Bradley," Isabella interrupted, her tone brooking no argument, "your objection is noted and overruled. I have made my decision based on careful legal analysis, not emotion. If you wish to appeal this ruling, you may do so after the conclusion of this trial. Now, shall we proceed with opening statements?" Nellie Hansen rose first, her opening statement painting a devastating picture of institutional racism disguised as medical practice. She detailed case after case of families who had been told their children were mistakes or mix-ups, when in fact the hospital had deliberately manipulated test results and falsified records to encourage white parents to abandon children who didn't meet their racial expectations. "The evidence will show," Hansen declared, "that Mercy General Hospital operated a systematic program of genetic discrimination. They told loving parents that their own children were somehow not theirs, exploiting racial prejudices to separate families and destroy the bonds between parents and children." When Hansen described the Collins family's case, Isabella found herself reliving those early days through the lens of the legal record. The testimony of Dr. Neal, now frail but determined to right past wrongs, revealed the pressure that had been applied to her parents to abandon their newborn daughter. Dr. Neil will testify, Hansen continued, that the hospital's policy was to discourage white families from keeping children who appeared to be of mixed race. The Collins family was told their daughter was a hospital error, despite genetic testing that clearly proved she was their biological child. Only their courage in choosing love over fear prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed 3 lives. Bradley's opening statement attempted to minimize the hospital's culpability while shifting blame to the families themselves. These parents, he argued, made their own choices based on their own prejudices. The hospital provided medical information and counseling, but the ultimate decisions were made by the families themselves. We cannot hold a medical institution responsible for the personal biases of its patients. As the trial proceeded over the following weeks, Isabella found herself witnessing her own origin story through the testimony of witnesses who had been present at her birth. Dr. Neil, despite her advanced age, provided devastating testimony about the hospital's discriminatory practices. I was told to emphasize the complications that would arise from raising a child who didn't match the parents' racial background, Dr. Neil testified, her voice shaky but determined. We were instructed to suggest that these children would be better served by families who shared their ethnic heritage. It was a euphemistic way of encouraging white families to abandon children who didn't look white enough. The most powerful testimony came from other families who had been affected by the hospital's practices. Rita Rodriguez told of being pressured to give up her daughter because the baby appeared too light-skinned. James Washington described being told his son wasn't really his because the child's features didn't match racial stereotypes. Family after family took the stand to describe the trauma of being told their children weren't really theirs. When Bertha Collins took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Isabella watched her mother, the woman who had raised her, loved her, and fought for her, describe the most shameful period of their family's history with unflinching honesty. I was ashamed, Bertha testified, tears streaming down her face. I was ashamed of my own daughter because she didn't look like what I expected. The hospital told us she was a mistake, and we almost believed them because it was easier than confronting our own prejudices. Oscar's testimony was equally powerful. We almost abandoned our daughter because we were scared of what other people would think. The hospital exploited our fears and made us feel like victims instead of parents. If we had walked away from Isabella, it would have been the greatest mistake of our lives. Bradley's cross-examination was brutal, but ultimately ineffective. He tried to portray the Collins family as opportunistic litigants seeking financial gain, but the genuine emotion in their testimony made his accusations ring hollow. Isn't it true, Mrs. Collins, Bradley pressed, that you're only filing this lawsuit now because your daughter is in a position to rule in your favor? Bertha's response was swift and fierce. Mr. Bradley, we're filing this lawsuit because what happened to us was wrong, and we don't want it to happen to other families. We're not looking for money. We're looking for justice. As the trial neared its conclusion, Isabella realized that the case had become about more than institutional accountability or financial compensation. It had become a public reckoning with the ways that medical institutions could exploit racial prejudices to manipulate families into making decisions they would regret forever. The expert testimony was overwhelming. Medical geneticists explained that the mistakes claimed by the hospital were scientifically impossible. Sociologists detailed the broader context of medical racism in American healthcare. Psychologists described the long-term trauma experienced by families who had been torn apart by discriminatory practices. In her closing argument, Nellie Hansen painted a picture of systematic injustice disguised as medical care. The evidence is clear, she declared. Mercy General Hospital operated a program designed to separate families based on racial prejudice. They told loving parents that their children weren't really theirs, exploiting fear and bias to achieve eugenic goals. Bradley's closing argument was a desperate attempt to minimize the hospital's responsibility. These families made their own choices, he insisted. We cannot hold a medical institution responsible for the personal decisions of its patients, no matter how misguided those decisions may have been. When the time came for Isabella to render her verdict, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of her gavel would have echoed like thunder. She looked out at the packed gallery, seeing her parents in the front row, seeing the other families who had been affected by the hospital's practices, seeing the reporters and legal observers who would carry news of this decision to the world. This case, Isabella began, her voice steady and clear, is about the fundamental principle that medical institutions have a duty to provide care based on scientific evidence, not racial prejudice. The evidence presented in this trial demonstrates that Mercy General Hospital systematically violated that duty. She detailed the hospital's discriminatory practices with the precision of a legal scholar and the passion of someone who had lived through their consequences. The verdict was unanimous and comprehensive. The hospital was liable for damages, required to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies, and mandated to establish a fund to help families locate children who had been separated through their discriminatory practices. But the most powerful moment came when Isabella addressed her parents directly. "Bertha and Oscar Collins," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "You have shown remarkable courage in bringing this case forward. You have transformed your own moment of weakness into a fight for justice that will protect countless other families." She paused, looking directly at the people who had raised her, loved her, and taught her the meaning of redemption. "Your decision 30 years ago to choose love over fear not only saved our family, it gave you the strength to fight for justice today. This court finds that your courage and growth serve as an example of the power of second chances and the possibility of redemption." As the gavel fell and the courtroom erupted in applause, Isabella saw her parents embrace, tears streaming down their faces. They had completed a journey that began with fear and shame and ended with justice and redemption. The scared young couple, who had almost abandoned their daughter, had become the advocates who fought to ensure that no other family would experience their pain. The case would establish important legal precedents for medical discrimination, but its real victory was more personal. A family that had been nearly destroyed by institutional racism had not only survived but thrived, and in the end, they had used their experience to make the world a little more just. Isabella removed her robes that evening, knowing that she had presided over more than a legal proceeding. She had witnessed the completion of a circle that began with abandonment and ended with justice, proving that sometimes the children we almost lose become the very people who save us in the end. And as Bertha and Oscar Collins left the courtroom that day, they knew that their greatest victory wasn't the legal judgment. It was the realization that the daughter they had almost abandoned had grown up to be exactly the person the world needed her to be. If you've made it this far, thank you. May this story remind you, love isn't always born. Sometimes it's chosen, even when it hurts. If this touched you, consider subscribing, and I'll see